Going live, going live. All right, I'm live. Hello, everyone. HP Hollow here, back again to read Chapter 3 of Monster Punk Horizon. For those of you who were not with me approximately 1 minute ago, I'm just going to go through my usual sales spiel. This is my book, Monster Punk Horizon, Book 1. It's a series starter. It is already out on Amazon and in Kindle Unlimited and in paperback form, and will be out in audio very, very, very soon. So please go buy my book so I can write more books. Yay. All right. Now we are going to begin the next chapter. And chapter 2 was super short. Chapter 3 is enormous. So, like, grab a snack and some water or something because we're going to be here for a little bit. Speaking of water, get hydrated so I can survive this reading. And here we go. Chapter 3, The Boss. Pix was the sort to over-prepare, and today she was glad she had. She was already in her best armor, a combination of sturdy bone, fireproof Ignifex hide, and random metal pieces she'd found at the thrift shop, all obscured under a blue tabard because otherwise it looked mismatched and stupid. She hadn't expected to need such armor today, but she'd only just carved the materials necessary to craft the Ignifex bits and wanted to break it in, and easy survey missions were perfect for that. Even so, she'd still brought 2 full flasks of Darla's green bitter ale and a selection of nut breads meant to counteract various adverse conditions, along with doubles of other standard kit components like jerky and bandaging for small injuries. She'd sharpened her grappler, recalibrated her pod launcher, outfitted her cloak with camouflaging mantis gems, and filled several pockets with charges for the centerpiece of her ensemble, her capacitor blade. It was about half the size of Jazz's greatsword, but its primary difference was the cylinder at the base of its blade, loaded with a circuit of mysteric capacitors that would unleash a massive shock of whatever glitter magic she'd loaded. Though it wasn't as impressive as Jazz's weapon, it was still made of quality glist iron, and it was the best capacitor blade she could possibly build at this point. For someone of her experience, it was not a bad kit, but it was still lacking one thing. You know, we should really consider hiring some Catians if you're going to go barreling off after colossal undocumented monsters, Pix said as she and Jazz traipsed through the jungle. At the very least, for the extra eyes. Also, take off your dragon head. We don't need to be attracting random nut pidges with a new monster running about. Jazz raspberried and yanked at the mask. Her goofy dragon neck pulled away to reveal a head of dark, sporty, shoulder-length hair and skin that was much better suited to the high sun of the jungle than Pix's pasty mayonnaise tone. But then that was why Pix equipped gems cut to deflect sunlight. Jazz, meanwhile, roamed the jungle in what amounted to monster skin, hot pants, and whatever other starter pieces looked interesting at the thrift shop, which put her in a mess of bones, leather, and fur that, while equally as ridiculous as Pix's armor, at least had the good fortune to occur in matching shades of red. I've got too many college loans to be thinking about Catiants, Jazz retorted. If we had Catiants looking out for us, we'd bring in more loot that would help us pay off our loans faster, Pix continued. Not to mention we'd be less likely to die. If I die, my college loan problem is solved. I wouldn't be so sure of that. Does your dragon line regenerate? Nearly every native under the Dazzling Skies had dragon blood somewhere in their ancestry, a consequence of the elder dragons being one of the first races to fall from the sky when it had opened. They fell asleep soon afterward, but not before fear of their own extinction led them to reproduce with the other original Skyborns, after taking the proper form, of course. Back then, the elder dragons frequently spent time in simpler forms for the quaint amusement of it. The dragon line had still nearly died out, as most of the other races had been genetically incompatible. But fortunately for the dragons, there had been one race that wasn't. Humans, it turned out, were not only genetically compatible with most other Skyborns, but would copulate with literally anything if they were bored or curious enough, as long as it talked and had bulges in interesting places. There hadn't been many humans in the early days, but that hadn't stopped them from contributing their bipedal build, general resilience, and some claimed their species' innate luck to the vast majority of the now native population. Between magical dragon blood and lucky human blood, most natives were well equipped for the extreme situations under the Dazzling Skies, but different lines bestowed different benefits. including the ability to literally not die. Jaz looked up in rare thought, as if she'd never pondered her dragon line before. Come to think of it, I don't know, she said. Does yours regenerate? No, my dragon ancestry is so diluted by this point that the only thing I get out of it is pointy ears. Jaz felt the tips of her ears as if she hadn't been living with them her entire life. Damn, my ears are way pointier than yours. My point is, Pix continued, you should figure out whether you're going to come back before you start making escape plans that end with dying. Besides, if you actually die, your family's going to come after me. You say that as if we're not likely to die together. The point is to not die at all. Pix rolled her eyes for the 5th time in as many minutes. Really, it was astonishing they'd been partners this long. They'd met on the mainland at Mysteric University, where an abysmally inaccurate roommate pairing algorithm had placed the level-headed, academically minded Pix with, well, all that was Jaz. Pix had a plan. She was going to study monstrous ecology with the express intent of researching the monsters and biomes across the Dazzling Seas. Simple. Jaz had no plan. She majored in something random because her interests changed every semester anyway, and when she found out Pix was heading to the monstrous continent, she figured she'd come too, because why not? Jaz was from an elite family on the mainland who didn't think well of her becoming a monster hunter when they'd planned for her to join her sisters in the family business. Monsters on the mainland had evolved differently than those of the monstrous continent. The fauna here had been roaming without significant civilized influence for centuries. Monsters on the mainland, if one could even call them that, had developed alongside advancing society, and these days the two existed in a close symbiotic relationship. Where the monstrous continent was largely wild and unsettled, the wondrous continent had a few unexplored corners. Over the centuries, people and their companion monsters had sown an eclectic blanket of civilization over the land, from the garden of parks and pastel cottages that made up Indigo Town, to the blue-green sprawl of roots, treehouses, and seafront that was Mangrove Beach, to the glowing metropolis of jewel-toned skyscrapers that made up Opal City, at the heart of which beat Mysteric University, the headquarters of all monster-related research. The natives and Skyborns had worked together to conceive it, of course, but it was all facilitated by the unique powers of the monsters themselves, such that they were inseparable from its success. Those mainland monsters still needed ways to expend their excess mysteric energy, though, and over the years, Jaz's family had built a sporting empire out of that basic need. Team Red was one of several champion franchises, and Jaz was supposed to be one of her family's monster training champions. Problem was, Jaz was absolute dung at anything that involved strategy. Her family had sent her to college hoping she'd develop some skills that would be useful on the sidelines, but she was dung at anything that involved structure, too. She wore her family name like a straitjacket, and when Pix told her about her plans for the monstrous continent, that straitjacket broke. Some people were not meant to live in organized societies. Jaspertina Red was one of those people. She thrived on the unpredictable energy of chaos, and that made her perfectly suited to this world. Of course, it also meant she regularly brought chaos with her, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Extreme circumstances often led to extreme discoveries, after all, and though Jaz was unbridled, she wasn't careless. Not completely. That was what kept Pix with her. For though Jaz brought her own breed of trouble, she was the kind of person who would merrily go to the hell pits and back for her friends, and somehow bring some demon fae home for drinks afterward so they had drinking buddies for the next time they ended up in said hell pits. And a person who could turn demon fae into friends was a truly useful one indeed. Pix was fairly certain Jaz was after this new monster specifically so she could befriend it. But even that wasn't entirely inconvenient. As they walked, Pix opened her logbook to a clean page in the back and marked it for future use. The pattern bellowed on the harbor's skull organ was clear, observation only, unless the need for a hunt became obvious. After all, in cases like this, there was always a chance that the monster was not innately aggressive, but rather just scared and alarmed at suddenly being in a strange new world. They could decide whether it was truly dangerous after they knew a bit more about it. Jaz, in front, crouched to examine a set of indentations in the soil. 4 digits radiated out from the central metacarpal pad like sunbeams cresting the horizon, ending in sharp, deep claw marks. Ignifex on the field, she reported. The print's still sharp around the edges, so it's pretty fresh. Oh, we so don't need to deal with an Ignifex today, Pix sighed, as Jaz put her face to the track and sniffed. Smells like he's amped up his mucus production, too, she continued. He's agitated. We need an agitated Ignifex even less, Pix groaned. Or we could be lucky this new thing wandered into Ignifex territory, Jaz replied. Maybe it's weak to fire and general whompings. When have we ever been that lucky? Oh, dung! Pix exclaimed, for just as she said the operative word, a warbling belch of a roar split the air, and a massive sinuous shape reared from the shadows. Or rather, plopped from the shadows. But with an Ignifex, even a plop was the stuff of nightmares and a sudden need for fresh pants. The Ignifex was most simply described as a salamander. If a salamander was 15 feet long with muscular, tensile legs that could launch at an equal length, a ripped, red, chunky body that could slam nearly any creature into submission with a single blow, and a goofy, goggle-eyed face with a swollen neck pouch that made one question whether this monster had put on the right head when it left to go prowl that morning. As if that wasn't enough, its entire body shone with a thick reddish mucus and the source of many of the rainforest's woes. For when the Ignifex felt truly threatened, it clicked a hard plate at the front of its mouth. Don't let it click, Pix screeched, and with one fluid, instinctive motion, both hunters snatched their weapons from their holsters, Jaz her beloved greatsword, and Pix her nearly as beloved capacitor blade. Unfortunately, caught off guard and within a foot of the monster's death plop, they were in no position to stop it. The monster clacked its bony beak. A tiny spark spat from its mouth, and then flashed across its entire body in an enormous whoomph of flame. Jaz and Pix threw their blades up as shields, but that didn't stop odd flecks of flaming mucus from spattering off the creature and onto their armor. Pix didn't worry. Her Ignifex hide pieces were naturally resistant to the mucus flame. Jaz was not so lucky. She still wore her novice leathers because they were comfy and broken in, and only that. But then Jaz had once cooked a corn dog with her bare hand on a dare and came away with exactly one blister, so fire didn't matter to her dragon line as much as it did Pix's. Both leapt to keep their distance as the Ignifex lunged and rolled, scattering its mucus flames around the underbrush and igniting everything it touched. But less and less as the minutes passed. Hey, Doug! Hello again! An Ignifex never burned for more than a few minutes. Usually that was all the time it needed to scare off a threat, as long as that threat wasn't a hunter hoping to cull the population. Ignifex was considered the apex predator of the area closest to Skull Harbor. Thus far lacking a natural predator and prone to setting the forest on fire, it was one of the few monsters actively culled as a genuine threat to the ecosystem. Not to mention a source of useful resources and a fair test of a young hunter's skill. It took a fairly experienced hunter to bring one down. Pix and Jaz were just barely experienced enough. With another irritated warble roar, the Ignifex rolled off the last of its defensive mucus, and Pix saw her moment. She queued up a glitter blue capacitor. Ignifex hated the chills that water magic unleashed on the body, while Jaz just wound up to chop the heck out of whatever part her blade hit. Her opal would do the rest of the work for her. They both watched for the Ignifex's tells, a grunt, a roll, a bumbling crouch. They weren't fast monsters. In fact, they were rather clumsy, but very often that clumsiness caused them to bumble into a single good hit, and with its fearsome girth, one hit was all an Ignifex needed. There came the crouch! The monster sprang for Pix. She jumped out of the way, just in time for Jaz to swing her sword into the creature's head in a spray of magical blue sparkles. So the opal chose water magic too, Pix observed. It didn't kill the creature. Ignifex skulls were dense, and made fantastic shoulder pauldrons for that matter. But the heavy impact did addle the beast enough for Pix to leap onto its back and plunge her blade into the red gems that grew along its spine. She squeezed the first trigger branching over her hilt, and at once the cylinder glowed with a great blinding crack. When the charge was at its brightest, she squeezed the second trigger. The central chamber of her blade radiated pure glittering blue. A cloud of sparkling magic particles blasted out from the wound, and the Ignifex screeched as if it had just gotten brain freeze all over its body. "Pix, look out!" Jaz shouted, but Pix knew what she was yelling for. Before she could pull out the blade, the Ignifex rolled. Everyone knew to look out for that sort of move. The Ignifex liked to lure enemies close with the promise of an easy blow, only to turn their proximity against them with a lazy, vicious belly flop. But knowing it was coming and successfully avoiding it were two completely separate things, especially when one's foot was planted on a weakened piece of gem. The Ignifex lurched, and the crumbling gem on its back shattered under Pix's heel. But she was Pix, and as such, she was prepared for this too. She twisted midair, jammed the point of her capacitor blade into the ground, and then pulled her final special trigger. Her blade split down the middle, revealing a glowing spellglass rod, and with another flick of her second trigger, it unleashed a blinding beam of blue light. The combo wasted one of her charges, but it also blew her backward, out of the Ignifex's reach, and she landed and slid to a solid, practiced stop. She discovered that move completely by accident in her first week of hunting, then practiced it over months at the training grounds, and as excessive as it had come in handy more than once. The Ignifex paused at the end of its roll, confused that it hadn't felt a satisfying, crunchy squish, and now its goggled eyes looked in Pix's general direction as if reconsidering the life choices that led it to attack this clever creature. Can we get it to run? Pix wondered. Or would have wondered if she hadn't been interrupted by a brain-shattering screech. Protected by their earworms, she and Jaz didn't hear its full terror, but the Ignifex did, and it yowled as if the sound had reached straight into its little walnut brain and pureed it into a nice, smooth spread that would go well on some toasted brown bread. Pix rolled out of the Ignifex's path and rejoined Jaz, just as another shadow descended over the trees and sent a sharp, barbed whip of an arm straight through the Ignifex's skull. The Ignifex didn't even cry out. It crumpled like a sad pile of rejected sausage meat, the apex predator of the Skull Harbor jungle reduced to nothing with a single snick. Told you it wasn't a vegetarian, Jaz whispered through her earworms. All the more reason to hide, Pix spat. At that, the two hunters scrambled for cover. Even someone as freewheeling as Jaz knew, scared or not, a creature that could take out an Ignifex with one blow was serious business. Both snatched their cloaks from their kits and flung them over their heads as they waited for it to land, better to obscure themselves for observation, and to increase their likelihood of not joining the new monster's kebab. Pix had mostly equipped mantis gems because she had a ton of them, and didn't own any of the really good defensive gems yet. But of all the things she was glad to have packed today, she was particularly glad for these. Most cloaks were at least minimally good for hiding, but once she fastened the two gems in her neck clasp together, her entire image wavered until the details of her form were obscured, as if in a heat haze. No lapidary had yet found a cut that could render full camouflage from a mantis gem, but this was good enough to fool most monster eyes. Now safely hidden, Pix nestled behind a large fern and opened her book to her marked page, ready to record once the monster landed. But it didn't. In fact, the next time they heard it screech, it was deeper into the jungle and far enough away that it must have forgotten its kill nearly as soon as it was made. It's not killing for food, Pix said. And that was no accident, Jaz echoed, separating the gems on her own neck clasp. You can't spear an Ignifex's brain by accident. Pix nodded, and then pulled a little flare gun from her kit and fired 3 red bursts into the air. Soon after, the resonant notes of the harbor's skull organ blared out over the jungle, the new tune relaying new orders. This monster is dangerous. Initiate hunt. We need to research it before we even have a chance of bringing it down, Pix said, standing and returning her items to her kit. Wait, what are you doing? Getting my pauldron, Jaz replied. She'd brought out her carving knife and had begun to slice through the monster's skin with a practiced hand that had done so many times before. No point in letting this big boy go to waste. Plus, I'm sure we'll be able to find a fire station that'll buy the fireproof leather off us, not to mention all the stuff we can use the fat for. We don't have time, Pix objected. You want to leave him for the waspas? Jaz retorted. You know, if we had Caterians, they could do the carving for us while we continued the hunt. Another screech went up in the distance, likely another meaningless kill. Fine, Jaz huffed, then put away her carving knife and unrolled a little red flag from her pack, sewn with the insignia of the Dragon Pig Pirates. She tied it around one of the dead monster's horns, then rigged a small trap of stink bombs so that anyone who moved it would get a malodorous surprise. Trap set, she stood back to admire her work with a smug smile. Pix rolled her eyes and the two set off. The screeching creature never landed, but despite the lack of tracks, it wasn't hard to follow. Persistent screeches aside, it left a trail of punctured corpses, mostly ignifex, all dead by no effort at all. The latest hung from a mess of thick vines as if caught there mid-leap, and showed no signs of struggle, just a single bloody jab through the skull and a more goggled than usual face frozen dead mid-confusion. It's only killing apex predators, Pix said. Could be asserting dominance. Oh, what's it gonna do when it figures out we're the actual apex predators? Jaz groaned. Pix didn't want to think about that. All the more reason to pursue it, she said. She tried to sound bold, but the truth was, she didn't want to think about what would happen when they caught up with it either. There were already dangerous monsters in this world, of course, and she and Jaz hadn't even faced most of them yet. But inevitably someone had, and there were always veteran hunters who had hunted native monsters so frequently that they found even the mysterious eldritch variants predictable. But skyborn monsters like this one, with no connection to this natural world, not even a legendary hunter like the Madmiral would know where to start. Hunters like Pix and Jaz, though, could bring her the information to help get her started, and so they pressed on. They were in the midst of surveying the latest ignifex corpse when another screech dropped the very bugs from the thick forest air, shuddered the motes wafting through the canopy sunbeams, and even rattled the earworms in their perches. They were close, and it wasn't the only noise they heard. The screech was immediately followed by a loud guttural bellow that made the typical ignifex roar sound like a kitten's mew, and a great earth-shattering crash that could only be produced by a truly giant and pissed-off salamander. From behind the nearby tree cover, an apocalyptic plume of flame exploded up through the canopy. Oh, dung, Pix cursed, for she knew exactly what that was. It wouldn't matter if they tracked invisibly now, for the two fighting monsters would have ample distraction between themselves. Pix and Jaz sprinted through the forest toward the noise and finally came to a great sunny clearing and a massive clash of horns, whips, claws, and flames. They dove behind a freshly thrashed over boulder right as another spurt of flame blasted in its direction. How the flame missed its target they had no idea. The skyborn monster was big enough that a small band of hunters could spread a picnic between its shoulders with a little extra room for frisbee. Extreme frisbee if they played down the length of its spine. And though a whole floor shorter in height, the monster it had challenged was more than comparable in girth and ferocity. Dang, it's already fighting with the boss, Jaz exclaimed. Every hunter in Skull Harbor knew this monster. Hold it, gotta take a water break. Pardon me. All right, hydration complete. Let's see. He towered 30 feet high and 30 feet long. The gems on his spine cracked and ragged with battle damage. His brimstone-speckled skin crossed with ferocious scars, none of them new. His claws belied his age, long and serrated with abuse, and the great full expanse of his quadruple neck pouches and ever-full belly suggested a monster who never had difficulty finding enough to eat. Even more telling, though, was the incredible protrusion of his skull, so thick with bony armor that even the screecher's barbs had not been able to penetrate it. They hadn't even nicked it. And now it was facing an opponent that was not only giant, pissed off, and on fire, but also hella deaf in its advanced age, and thus impervious to the monster's screeches. No one had hunted the boss Ignifex in decades, possibly longer. He was a legend in his own right, a creature who'd been tough and mean enough to survive generations of hunters and reach new heights of evolution that other Ignifex didn't have the brains to imagine. He had the confident, powerful demeanor of a creature who'd consider making you an offer you couldn't refuse, and then just decide to eat you because it was easier than going through all that trouble. At the best of times, the boss Ignifex gave precisely 0 Fs, editing again, for anything that crossed its path. And this was certainly not the best of times. The boss Ignifex glared beadily from within the flames of its own body, settled slowly into a low, defensive stance, and then it leapt. Its great clashing prop of a landing sent a near seismic wave of force rippling along the ground. The tremor shifted Pix and Jaz's hiding boulder again as if it were no more than a lump of meat bobbing in a thick stew, and they scrambled to escape its roll. As they did, the boss's blow missed its target. They saw the screecher take to the air. Its whips flailed down to the Ignifex but did no good. The boss's dorsal hide was too bony and too gemmy. The Screecher quickly decided that it would have to attack from underneath, and the plump, flattened roll of the Ignifex's belly made its vulnerability clear. It was all flesh, perfect for puncturing. The Screecher plunged to the ground, dove low, and shot a whip straight for the Ignifex's obvious belly. It pierced in, but not as deeply as the monster had likely intended. For though the boss's belly was fleshy, it was also thickly calloused from decades of dragging across the rough jungle ground. The Ignifex batted the barb out like it was no more than a pesky thorn, and then glared back out at the Screecher as if to ask, "When you going to start fighting?" That gave the Screecher pause, which, in turn, gave Pix and Jaz their first good look at the monster. The creature landed out of reach of the boss Ignifex's lethal plop. Its wings angled for emergency takeoff, its head perked in observation, and Pix used the respite to start sketching in her book. The creature looked like it had been created by a 7-year-old who'd started drawing a dragon, but halfway through decided to change it to the most badass bug she could imagine. Its lithe, six-legged body moved under a thick, black sheen of chitinous armor, which peaked at the end of a long, equally armored neck in a proud warrior's helmet of horns and jaws. This 7-year-old must have had a particular thing for beetles, because its head looked like she'd gone through a book of the fiercest-looking scarabs and drawn all their neatest parts until she ran out of head. At which point she started placing the antler-like horns along its spine, shoulders, haunches, and every other unadorned joint, and finally topped it off with a pair of manta ray-like stingers just because, which flowed out from the base of its neck like a deadly scarf, because why not? "Have you ever seen a bug like that?" Pix trembled. "Technically, it might be an arachnid," Jaz said, "if we're counting the stingers as legs. Doesn't have antennae either." Pix looked up from her logbook to glare. "What? I gotta get some use out of that entomology degree," Jaz retorted, but then paused to consider. "Which is actually a moot point, because no, I've never seen a creature like that. Bug, arachnid, or otherwise." "Wonderful," Pix sighed. "That just means it's gonna make a badass set of armor," Jaz replied. "Someone's gotta beat it first." As if on cue, someone decided to try. With a war cry to rival the Ignifex's roar, a cluster of 20 hunters barreled out of the forest, some heavily armored, some in patchwork sets that looked like they'd been put together during a hangover, some in ostentatiously scanty sets involving little more than underwear or gossamer robes that must have been assembled on a dare, but all of them buff and swinging an assortment of compensatorily sized greatswords, hammers, war axes, and one inexplicable oversized bagpipe. The frat men had all met in a university at the the frat men had all met in a fraternity at the Mysteric University, and though they'd left the frat had very much not left them. "Kalo Kanigi!" they belted, their frat call and simultaneously their war cry and an old invocation for a successful hunt. The bagpipe waved through the air like it belonged to a marching band musician who'd actually wanted to join the color guard, let out a dramatic series of sickly-sounding squonks, and then the crowd swarmed the monster's feet. Their strategy for this monster, as with most monsters, basically came down to just hit it a lot. Granted, for heavy damage dealers, this was usually sufficient, but as Pix and Jaz watched, they realized again that this monster was far from the usual. For 20 greatswords, hammers, war axes, and a bagpipe were bashing its tarsals, and it hadn't even looked down. "Are they using debuffs at all?" Jaz squinted. Pix pulled her goggles down from her forehead and adjusted the magnification. Every now and then she saw a puff of color burst from within the swarm. "Glitter white pods," she replied. "Ah, makes sense," Jaz said. "Bug or lizard, it's gonna hate extreme cold." "The cold can't affect it if it can't get through, though, and they haven't even cracked that exoskeleton. I don't think it's even noticed them yet." Suddenly Jaz took off her pack. "I have an idea. Who else is out here?" "Let me see." Pix focused her goggles on the forest surrounding the clearing. It took some looking, but she knew what she was looking for, and soon she spotted their allies. All were hidden under mantis cloaks, but she recognized the faces and weapons peering from the shadows of the camouflage. "The Master Trainers," she reported. "The Bone Pickers, the Ebon Destiny, the Obsidian Destiny, the Shadow Destiny. Anyone who's less of a noob than us," Jaz groaned. She hadn't hadn't actually encountered any of those groups before, but you could always recognize the new useless ones from their epic-sounding Dark Destiny-obsessed names. Pix readjusted her goggles and looked harder. The Waspas, dung. The Booty Lords, better. The Fashion Hunters, the Apple Enthusiasts, the Generic Researchers. Any Mysteric Specialists, Bug Hunters? Got both in one! The Buggers! Pix shouted. Okay, but who is it? Jaz inquired. No, that's their name, Pix elaborated. They specialize in bug monsters. Do they look like they have any? Oh, look! Pix interrupted. For another hunter had stepped into the clearing. She could have been an honorary member of the Fratmen, had she not predated them by decades and in fact been one of the pivotal founders of Skull Harbor. Her bare arms bulged with muscle corded from years upon years of monster hunting. Her wizened eyes glared from a face that had stared down an eldritch stellaric titan and now wore its skin as a bombastic set of leather armor. She hadn't come out of that battle completely unscathed. One reality-ripping attack had blown her hair into a cascade of spikes, and it had never really rested after that. But as far as she was concerned, that was a small price to pay for the crowning jewel of the whole assemblage, her own stellaric opal, implanted directly into her chest because she didn't carry a weapon. A hunter like the Madmiral didn't need to. All she had to do was inhale. The opal in her chest began to glow with the glittering colors of every universe known and unknown, and the illumination grew like the light of a new star being born. She opened her mouth, and a beam of incomprehensible brightness exploded out. It illuminated the clearing with a searing, reality-splitting brilliance. Jaz's eyes screamed from the pain of the light, and yet starved to stare into its depths, into the leagues and stars and worlds that seemed to gaze back across the chasm the woman had opened with her incredible power. And then it was gone, its only remnant an undulating ripple of light that shimmered along the monster's armor. The Screecher noticed that. Well, dung. Looks like it absorbs mysteric attacks, the Madmiral observed. Her earworms carried the words to every hunter in the area. I have an idea, Jaz shot back over the earworms, then snatched a small pouch from her pack and made to run for the fray. Pix snatched her wrist before she could. What kind of idea? The only one left, Jaz responded. You stay here and collect data. I'll give you something to collect. Pix stared blankly as her partner sprinted for the field, toward a monster that not even the Madmiral's stellaric beam could touch. She glanced at the boss Ignifex, still on fire itself and peering out at the scene as if thinking a combination of, the heck? I thought this was my fight. And oh hell no, I didn't sign up for an Eldritch Titan. For if the Screecher could stand up to a stellaric beam, then that was exactly what kind of monster it was. Which was why the boss Ignifex promptly decided to snuff its flames out and nope right on out of there. Pix couldn't blame it. Buggers, listen up, she heard Jaz project to the hunters, and then Jaz relayed her plan. Sounds good. I'll hand it to you, the Madmiral replied, like a teacher handing a student a test. The Madmiral might have been legendary, but in her wizened age, her value was less in her capacity for brute force, more in her knowledge and willingness to pass it on. If she could one-shot a dangerous monster for the safety of Skull Harbor, she would, but in situations like this, she was more useful as an observer who could make sense of the chaos afterward and make a plan for the future. She retreated into the forest to find a good spot for observation. As she did, a small wave of camouflage began to move out from the tree line, and Jaz sprinted out with it. Under the distraction of the Fratmen and the retreating Madmiral, Jaz skirted the monster and then scaled her way up the horny protrusions of one leg up to its back. She landed between its shoulders at the thick bases of those barbed whips. She could take those out. If she could take those out, she'd take out the only part the monster had attacked with thus far. First, though, she had to get through that armor. Fortunately, that was her plan. Before the monster could realize she was there, she opened the pouch she'd brought and smashed the full contents at the base of one of the whips. A sickly sweet, decomposing smell began to waft up from the resulting puddle. Jaz tossed the empty pouch, unslung her sword from her back, and wound up for a massive cartwheel of a blow. It landed and cut a mere quarter-inch into the thick armor. But it was a quarter-inch more than they'd had before. A startled squonk noise burst out of the monster's mouth. No, not mouth, Jaz realized. Out of a vibrating set of chitinous cords beneath its jaws. That must have been the organ that produced those debilitating screeches. If they could take that out, too. The monster squonked again as a series of grappling hooks and arms began to make their way up to its back. Several beetle-horned or otherwise insectine helmets belonging to the buggers were the first to arrive, and Jaz pointed at the break she'd made. Breaker pods, lots of them. Took about 5 to make that break. At once, all the buggers snatched their pod pouches and smashed their full breaker pod stalks against the monster's back, which amounted to about 20 pods. Breaker juice wasn't something hunters could harvest. It was cultivated from the decomposing exoskeletons of insect monsters, and as a result was in significantly shorter supply than other items of its ilk. But as Jaz and the buggers bashed great swords, hammers, and every other close-range weapon into the whip, they gradually gained another quarter inch, and then another. By this point, the Fratinin had given up on the feat. They'd scaled the monster too, and were now climbing up to its whips, trying to weigh them down so that the monster couldn't use them to pierce Jaz and the buggers, and largely succeeding. The monster tried to flail them off, but they hung on like an awkward bunch of determined gorillas, shouting "Kalo Kinigi!" and then shouting it louder and whooping in the odd instance that one of them was thrown off. By now, Jaz and the others were 3 inches in, about 1/4 of the way through that massive stalk. Another irritated noise came from the monster's cords, as if it had forgotten it could unleash that awful screech. The buggers with ranged weapons still hung back idly, hesitant to fire into the close press of melee hunters. "Take out the cords," Jaz commanded. "Stop it from screeching." "Wait, dudes," one of the buggers shouted. A slick-looking fish man with black and white stripes crossing both his body and his wetsuit-like armor. "I'm going inside. See what I can do there." Before anyone could ask what he actually meant, he scaled the monster's neck, and when it rattled its cords for another squonk, crawled right between them and into the monster's throat. "What the F, Gary?" one of the buggers snapped, belatedly. This one had the face of a fluffy bipedal bat, his voluminous facial hair tied into coarse warrior's braids. He'll be okay," another fish man responded. "He did stuff like that all the time before we fell out of the sky. We're fish pilots." "The F is a fish pilot," the bat grumped, but another jolt of the monster's back reminded him that this was probably not the best time to engage in expository questioning. Instead, he returned his attention to the monster and raised his hammer for a blow. At the same time, Jaz dealt another quarter inch of a chop, but this one was different from the others. This one hit flesh, and a great cloud of freezing white shot out from her stellaric opal and penetrated beneath the armor. The screech that came from those cords then was even worse than the first one. The monster reared in screaming anguish. Its wail shattered their ears as profoundly as the Madmiral's beam had dazzled their eyes. Jaz's earworms exploded into juicy chunks, and the noise pierced through to her brain and scrambled it. Pix's earworms were safe at her distance, but that did nothing to diminish the awful wrenching in her stomach as the monster took to the air, flinging all the addled hunters off its back to the unforgiving ground below. She watched as the screecher left, flying deeper inland, away from the harbor. It had not expected that kind of threat, but now it had received a taste of what the Skull Harbor hunters could do. And it might be retreating now, but Pix knew a creature that selectively and purposefully attacked other predators wouldn't stay in hiding for long. The fallen fratmen were the first to come to, their voices rising in an addled but no less bombastic call of their invocation, "Kalo Kinigi!" "Kalo Kinigi," Pix echoed. They were going to need all the help they could get. And that is Chapter 3. Thank you all for hanging out with me and listening. Again, Monster Punk Horizon is available on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited right now if you would like to experience more of this story. It's also going to be out in audio very, very soon. And also, books 2 and 3 are lined up to come out in quick succession. Book 2 comes out in, let me look at my calendar, less than a month from now. It comes out on November 18th, and book 3 comes out on December 23rd, and they are both up for pre-order right now. Also, if you want to read some early free copies and like to review books, I am actually looking for early reviewers to get a glimpse of them and give me feedback. So you can comment below or contact me on my website at hollowwriting.com, and I will send you a link to a free book to read. Otherwise, you can pre-order them, or otherwise you can just say hey and whatnot. So thank you again for hanging out, and I will see you at the next video. Bye.